just a reminder to ask those in the chat. I'll be monitoring that as best I can. Yesterday demonstrated that the chat is very active, so I'll do my best to grab questions so that we can save those questions for the Q&A session at the end. If you can, when you're asking questions, if you have something for a specific speaker, if you could tag that speaker and say like who that question is directed toward, that would also help as well. If you're watching on YouTube, just post your questions in the comments. We have a separate person monitoring those comments. So I believe Clodagh is doing that today, and so she will pass those comments on to me, and we will get those to the speakers at the end of the session. So we have 3 speakers for today. This first session is centered around diversity and inclusion in the economics classroom. So we're really excited to hear these 3 speakers. Each person is going to have 10 minutes. And for those that are speaking, you can see in the top right corner of your screen about how much time has elapsed once you start. But I will also give this little chime whenever you have 2 minutes left. So I think everybody could probably hear that, right? So when you have 2 minutes left, I'll try and keep an eye and make that chime so that you know that you need to wrap up. Okay, I think that I've covered everything that I was asked to cover, but if not, I'm sure our first speaker will cover my bases for me. So first up today, we have Parama Chaudhry, and she is going to be talking to us about measuring the demographic attainment gap in economics for economics undergraduates. So I will pass it off to you.
Great, thanks very much, Brandon. Just gonna share my screen here, make sure that works. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. If not, just let me know. Yep, and everyone can hear me, right? Perfect. So thanks for coming, first of all, to everyone. My talk today is on a paper which is co-authored by 3 fantastic students, Otso, who graduated last year, and Hannah and Sam, who are literally finishing up as we speak, and I think are on here as well. So the motivation for this paper was to look more closely at why there is such a lack of diversity in the economics profession. And something that has been discussed, obviously, a lot in the news in recent months. Alongside that, in the past few years, in England, there's been a discussion about why it seems like BAME students, so non-white students, seem to be less likely to graduate with first-class degrees, so top marks, which are obviously a requirement to get into the top graduate programs, and doesn't hurt to have those grades if you're going straight into the job market as well. So I'm going to start the discussion by looking more closely at how grades vary by gender and ethnicity, then at what the median economics student looks like, and how this can be linked to the gaps in the grades that we observe. And then finally, policy implications of these findings. So this is an empirical exercise using detailed data from a single academically selective university, but we think the picture is not that different in other elite universities. We're only considering UK domicile students for 2 main reasons. First, we have more detailed data on them. On socioeconomic status, for example, but also we can then sort of control for things like language differences. So just to note, I will be using this word BAME fairly often because this is a standard category here in England. It stands for Black, Asian, and Minority Ethnic. And in just a minute, I will comment on the different ethnicities in there as well. And then finally, just to note that in the UK, when students apply for university, they apply for a major. So everyone we're speaking about here is studying for an econ degree. So how do marks vary by ethnicity and gender? So the first thing to note here is that the orange bars indicate the proportion of females who get first-class degrees, the top marks. Blue is for the males. And you can see that there's a gender gap in econ. What we've done is to show a bunch of different programs who all have equally high entry requirements. So it's almost like we're conditioning on high school grades to a certain extent. And you see even amongst those very selective programs, econ has a gender gap, and in some of those programs, women actually do well. But the difference for econ looks even bigger if you compare white males to everyone else. So here, the blue bars are white males, orange is everyone else. And you can see here that there's a big difference, and it's not surprising at all that the profession is so white and male if those people are much more likely than anyone else to get the good grades, go on to the top grad schools, and so on and so forth. So let's move on to looking at the characteristics of econ students, or the makeup of the econ classroom, just to see what we can uncover about the causes of these differences in grades that we observe. So what does the econ classroom look like? Well, we know, and our data shows that it's predominantly male, though that gap is smaller for BAME non-white students. If you now drill down into the individual ethnicities, this is where you see that most of the diversity is coming from Asian students, and because this is Britain, this is largely South Asian students. And it's noteworthy that there are very few Black students. So that means that, obviously breaking apart and looking at the ethnicities that are in that BAME category is a no-brainer, and also means that pretty much everything I'll be talking about here will be driven by the Asian students. So the final characteristic I'll talk about is socioeconomic status. So let's start with POLAR, which is a local area-wide index of deprivation, which is widely used here in England, and shows the quintiles of POLAR. So that blue bar shows you the top quintile. So it's showing that econ students, more than 60% of them come from the 20% most privileged areas. So one may say that this level of privilege is because econ is so selective academically. So what we did was we looked at similar programs. So again, the same high levels of entry requirements, and tried to compare that with econ. So if we start at the bottom there with the polar quintiles, what you see is that the bottom quintile doesn't actually look that different for econ. But if you look at the top quintile, so the fifth quintile, that's where you see that econ is more skewed. If you go up a little bit to look at ethnicity, you see that econ's much less likely to have Black students. Then if you go on further to look at secondary school type, this is really interesting because more than 90% of kids in this country go to state-funded schools. That's the first row in that category. Econ actually looks quite good here. So we have 41% of our students coming from state-funded schools. But that good news is a little bit misleading. Our data set is actually really unique because we know what exact schools students come from. So we can map this to various school characteristics from the government's Department of Education. So we've done this in this next table. The yellow highlights are things that are statistically different from econ, which is the top row. So you can see that econ's quite different at the bottom end of the income distribution, which is the first set of columns, so the percentage disadvantaged. And it's quite different at the top end of the income distribution, which is the second set of columns, which is percentage going on to the best universities. The last point to note here, and again, we're comparing with programs which are equally selective. Last point to note here is that at the bottom here, we show the UK average for private or independent schools, the schools that the most privileged go to. If you look at the number for the percentage going on to the best universities, econ looks bad, even compared to those guys. Okay, so the final part of this analysis is a Oaxaca blinder decomposition. So this is a very standard technique in labor economics. So we're trying to figure out this gap that we've observed in the grades. How much of it is due to the different characteristics that we've just been talking about. So this graph shows you the results of our decomposition. And this is for the overall degree. So if you look at all the years of the degree, overall, the result that you end up with, your final GPA, for example, how much of that is, how much of the gap in that between BAME students and white students is because of the different characteristics that we just talked about. So first thing to note here is that the yellow bars tell you the amount of the difference that's explained by the different characteristics that we talked about. And the green bar is the total difference. So about half of the total difference is explained by the characteristics that we've talked about. You can see that polar is the one that explains most of that explained difference. And if you add that to the school quality variables that we just talked about, so general sort of putting all the socioeconomic status variables together, that's most of where the difference is coming from. But the pink bar is showing you how much of the difference is unexplained, and that's pretty big as well. So these could be variables that we just don't have in our data set that are maybe truly unobserved. It could be things like match quality, so the quality of the match between the individual and the program of the university, but it could of course be discrimination in the classroom. And we've all heard, I think in the last few weeks, a lot of anecdotes about this. So the final thing that we did was, because we had detailed information about the individual courses in each year of study for all of these students, we wanted to look at where this difference, the gap in grades, is coming from that we see in the overall grade. And we looked at required courses for the econ major versus optional courses for two reasons. A, the required stuff is fundamental. And then B, we wanted to see whether white students were strategically, systematically taking different courses. The answer to that is no. Most of the gap is coming from the required courses. So sort of any amount of strategizing on course choice isn't going to help. Very little of the gap in the first year required courses can actually be explained. And the amount of the gap in the second year that can be explained is, again, socioeconomic status, but bulk of it is unexplained. So what did we find? What we found that there are very few Black students and students from disadvantaged backgrounds, which says that there's a need to find out why and what we can do about this in relation to recruitment strategies. Perhaps more importantly, once these students are here, we need to think about retention strategies, which brings us to that second point, which is about the gap in compulsory courses. The sort of cheap win is to provide resources, targeted resources for learning support. But then perhaps we also need to step back and review more fundamentally the content, teaching, and assessment methods in these courses. And finally, just to end up, if you're looking at these results, if you know these results and you do admissions for a top graduate program, perhaps you should also be looking to evaluate or interpret sort of undergrad grades in a different way, giving this information in your admissions process. All right, I think I'm just over time. Sorry, Brendan. So thank you for listening. And I'm happy to take any questions in the Q&A in the chat, or you can get in touch with me via email or Twitter.
All right, thanks so much. That was really interesting, and we're getting some good questions in. So I'll look forward to the Q&A. Moving along, next we have my colleague from Elon University, Brooks Depro, is going to talk about an assignment that he created to help students discover diversity using an empirical project. So Brooks, I will pass it off to you.
All right, let me get my screen share. All right, so this is a program that we started about 1.5 years ago. We received a diversity inclusion grant from Elon to create some empirical projects for a new senior capstone course that we had for a new major for economic consultants. So this was designed for a smaller class. Last two times we've offered it, we've had roughly 12 students in each class. So I want to start off with just some of the results the students will get when they run this project. And I'm going to place the results in the context of the New York Times article by Lisa Cook and Anita Opoku-Agyeman. All right. So the first result I want to share with you is that our students were really interested in looking at entry-level positions. And so they wanted to know something about economists in the US who are under the age of 30 that had a bachelor's degree in economics. particularly women. And we're going to use the US Census's American Community Survey 5-year estimates to explore that answer. So women with bachelor's degree that reported being economists that were also under the age of 30 was 38%. Place that in the context of the Cook article, that's low relative to most majors in the US. If you look across all majors, roughly 57% of women are majoring in the field, in other fields. The second question we asked and looked at was focusing on kind of the intersection between gender and race. And so we looked at the shares of Black women with bachelor's degrees, again, using the American Community Survey. What we found is less than 1% of Black women with bachelor's degree were economists, all right? And so again, placing it in the context of the New York Times article, you can see pretty quickly that there's really a low number of Black women in this profession. And it's consistent with some of the stories we're seeing and the literature that we're seeing in this particular area. So the next slide I want to show you is a study by the economist Rhonda Sharp, who not only points to these types of statistics, but warns or points to the alarm that the growth in undergraduate economics degrees conferred to Black women has been fairly stagnant over the last 2 decades. And she provides some pretty compelling evidence. If you look at the change in the counts of undergraduate economic degrees by race as well as gender here, she particularly emphasized the trends for Black females in the profession. The change is only 47 over this time period. Growth rates were only 1%. And then you compare the growth rates to both white females as well as white and Black males in this article. So I really encourage you to take a look at this article if you're not familiar with it. It has a lot of great information and a different perspective on thinking about some of the studies we've seen to date, especially over the last 6 to 8 months. All right, so let's get on to some of the details of the empirical project, what it looks like, how we designed it in the class. Again, the goal is to empower students to find, report, and use the facts that I've just given you on the first 2 slides. A second part of the project, though, is to have students frame their own diversity questions, but I really encourage them to look at it from their own angles. So I don't give a lot of prompts in terms of what you should be studying. I let students do that from their own personal experiences and their own disciplines as well. And then last but not least, we emphasize both writing very concise 1-page memorandums. These folks are going into entry-level economist positions in the consulting world. And we also emphasize reproducible methods using Stata. So step 1 here is I try to link it to a real-world application. Katie and I both worked in the consulting field, and so kind of giving students an actual application in the context of a proposal seems really good in terms of what students would get exposed to. We emphasize who the audience is, whether we're going to write to the client or whether we're going to write to a proposal leader. We use the Small Business Administration's RFQ that they offered several years ago as a prompt for this particular project. And students have commented that being able to do or actually deal with the proposal that they face in the real world really makes this project really rich in terms of getting some experience of what they might face in the real world in their new employment. Second step, we want them to really practice finding and preparing data. The data set we use is the American Community Survey. We use the public use microdata set for this. Students have to create a custom data set from this source. What does that involve? Well, the students actually have to register for an account and agree to abide by the usage licenses. So they're not given the data, they've got to go find it and and see what it's like to find this data and sign up for it in the real world. Initially, I have them create a custom extract with these variables so they can produce those distributions you saw in the first 2 slides. And then the students have to download that extract. So they're going to get the data, the command files, and the code book. And the chief comment I get from students is, man, this data set's really large. It's compressed. How do I deal with it? And it really just seems really, really messy. And that's exactly what we want them to do. We don't want to give them a data set in Excel and just read it into Stata. We want them to actually work to get the data, work with messy data. Once the students have extracted that data set, we do an in-class lab and I present them with the model Stata analysis. Again, they produce the first 2 numbers in the slides. They'll use commands like describe, summarize, and tabulate. They also get some experiences in restricting the samples by occupation and age, as well as using commands related to sample weights. All right, and so very simple exercise, but students really like doing this, and it gives them some ideas on what to do for their next step of the project as well. And then students use regression analysis after they frame their own questions, so they'll have to go back and do an actual new extract with variables that they're interested in. All right, so the last step 4 is writing and reproducing results. They're doing a role play. Your audience is the proposal leader that wants you to perform some basic regression analysis. She asks you to use your creativity, identify your own angle, emphasis, and then you will have to do the following steps: collect new variables, use regression analysis, prepare a 1-page business memo, and then at the end, you have to deliver the Stata code and data to another economist, so they have to do a quality control check. So writing the script, common directory structures, and reproducing memo results. Wanted to give you 2 examples in closing of what some students have done in the project. This team was a group of white female economists. They were looking at the economic consultant industry as well as R&D industries where economists work, dividing up the story by gender. A second group included several white male economists as well as a black male economist. What they did is they looked at the jobs they're going to enter in and their occupations, looked them up in the American Community Survey, and did a racial breakdown compared to the fields as well. And some students have commented that this could be really helpful during interviews because they can see who their peers might be and see how different they are based on averages across the US as well. Lastly, we asked them to do a course reflection, asking some questions about whether this data influenced how they felt about economists or going in the economics profession. Just anecdotally, the first time we provided this survey, only the women responded to the survey, and we had a mix of being, some uncomfortableness in terms of what they found with the data, which is exactly what we do. The title of the presentation is Discovering Diversity, and it presents it in a way that is positive, but actually they actually find that there's a lack of diversity in the profession. And that wraps it up. That's my contact information, as well as Katie, my co-author.
All right, great. Thanks, Brooks. So again, some interesting data. I know we have some good questions coming in, so stick around for the Q&A at the end. So next up, we have Dr. Abdullah Abarani from Northern Kentucky University. I think he's coming to us live from beautiful Oman today, and he's going to talk to us about going beyond the syllabus to increase diversity and inclusion in our classroom. So Abdullah, I will pass it off to you.
Thank you for the introduction, Brendan. Opportunity of this conference and to see some of my friends and colleagues. Thanks to the organizers for the opportunity to share ideas. We're missing C-Tree this year. Brandon's introduced me. My name is Abdullah Abarani. I'm an associate professor of economics at Northern Kentucky University. I am also the director for the Center for Economic Education there. Please feel free to reach out to me via email or social media. This is a social media friendly presentation, so share, tag me at Dr. A. Albarani. Excited to you about a working paper that's been in the works for the past couple of years. It will be available next month. And the paper is on the importance of indicators and classroom management in our efforts to increase representation in the profession. The goal of my work is to provide educators with a collection of interventions to improve classroom management skills specifically, and hopefully better develop student-faculty interactions. What we know is, it is well documented in economics that we have a diversity problem. We've seen in the past couple of months, there's been discussions on social media about us needing to face our issues and re-examine our culture and our profession. Women and minorities in economics are underrepresented. Only 32% of undergraduates are women and only 16% are minorities. The evidence of the leaky pipeline is evident in this table. By the time we get to the professor level, the share of women's fallen to 14%, and for minorities, it's dropped to 6.5%. The unfortunate thing is that this is mainly an economics problem. These graphs are provided by Baer and Rouse 2016, and it shows how far behind economics is to other disciplines. Women and minority representation and doctoral degrees lower than in business, STEM, and social sciences. So this is an economics problem. The lack of diversity has for our profession. Bayer and Wilk 2019 show that higher rank institutions are even less diverse. And we know we have a hierarchy issue in economics, and due to this hierarchy issue, higher rank institutions have greater influence. They influence research, teaching, which leads to an influence on the economic outcomes. We therefore need more diversity in our profession. The way I see it is our profession has two problems. First, economics attracts less women and minorities into the major. Second, for women and minorities that do select into economics, they don't remain in the profession. So we must address our professional culture. Luckily, there are many people working on this. There's a lot of interventions being introduced at the graduate and professional level to minimize the leak. For a while, we ignored the role of undergrad economics education and how it can increase representation. This is where this audience can make a difference and join the effort in increasing the diversity of our profession. It is also where can make the biggest impact by attracting more diverse students, but also by creating a better academic culture. The interventions introduced at the undergraduate level can be summarized as following. First, mentoring and role models. Here, the goal is to increase interest by providing access to mentors and examples of and represented minorities. Examples of this intervention include Women in Economics Clubs, the Sadie Collective, AA Summer, and mentoring programs. The second intervention is to provide better information about what economics is and what economists do. The attempt is to break the stereotype that economics is about money markets and actually show that economics has broader applications. The third intervention is to invest in instruction and content that helps increase diversity and inclusion. This can be curriculum driven or project example of this, or top courses are a good example of this intervention. While these interventions are great and they are needed, there's been a lack of effort to address classroom management and student interaction. The role of faculty in the classroom and the need for interpersonal skills to interact with students to create a welcoming environment has been ignored. And therefore, it's the focus of this research. In fact, it's been my experience that when interpersonal communication skills are brought up in economics education, it's often ignored. What we know from research is that economic educators lack training and preparation to teach. From data provided by McGoldrick, Hoyt, and Colander, and also by Allgood, Hoyt, and McGoldrick, we know that less than 50% of economic educators have received educator training. 67% of new assistant professors wish their graduate program prepared them to teach. And more importantly, 75% of new educators wish they received training on how to interact with students and manage a classroom. The most common approach to learn management and student interaction for economists is to learn by doing. My opinion is that this is ineffective, an ineffective way of learning, and the consequences are high. We need to provide educators with a foundation to start from before they even walk into the classroom. This is why I introduced beyond the syllabus interventions to classroom management and student interactions. These interventions are available to instructors and researchers that are willing to test for possible interventions to increase diversity and inclusion. The paper is designed similar to Sheridan, Hoyt, and Amazaki's 2014 paper for years. In my paper, I reference their work and I anchor my tips on previously established frameworks and the focus is on increasing diversity through classroom management. I tie my interventions to Columbia's Guide to Inclusive Teaching and the AEA's recently released Working with Students Best Practices. The summary of the main principles are on this table, and each principle that I provide has 3 interventions in the paper. And I also show how they connect with the Columbia's Guide and the AEA's best practice, others. And I summarize them here. So 1 is focus on belonging by being welcoming in the classroom, and I give interventions on how you actually could do that. 2, set clear expectations for yourself and for your students. 3, select course content with diversity in mind. 4, I urge you to create accessible content, especially with this move to online. Finally, and most importantly, something that I truly believe in and I wish more educators would do is develop a growth mindset for their students, but also for themselves teaching. Before I leave today, I have to be clear that I offer my perspective. I see the world through my own lens, my own identity. As a person of color that grew up in the US as an international student, my approach in the classroom is intertwined with my identity. To create a more welcoming classroom, we must listen to different perspectives to start to see the world from different lenses. The interventions are research, how I navigate classroom. We do need more perspectives in economic education. Time doesn't permit me to go into each of these interventions. So if you're interested in receiving the paper next month when it's ready for circulation, fill out the interest form on my website. You could do that by aiming your phone camera to this QR code and it will take you directly to the form. Fill it out and I will send you that the paper when it's ready in July, or you could use the website link that I'm providing here. I really appreciate your time. Thank you to the organizers once again, and I look forward to the breakouts. Thanks.
All right, great. Thanks for that. So we are ready now to move to the Q&A session. So we have about 15 minutes for Q&A. And then after the Q&A, we've set aside about 10 minutes for breakout rooms. So you'll be put randomly into a room with a few other people, try to make some of those chance meetings happen, and you can get to know some of your colleagues, maybe that you don't know yet. So that'll be great. All right, so I've tried to go through and make a list. This is hard to do. And some of you have been answering questions in the comments. And so if I bring up something that you've answered, just gloss over it. So let's see. So Parama, I wanted to go first to you. and you said at the end of your presentation something that was really interesting, that undergraduate grades should maybe be interpreted differently by graduate admissions programs. And I was wondering if you could maybe say what you mean about that.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it was a bit of a throwaway comment just because I didn't have time to really go into it very much. But, what we're seeing is that, and like I said, this is the experience of one university, but I don't think it's that different elsewhere. So if there's systematic sort of, under achievement of grades, so it's not underachievement on the part of the students necessarily, it's the under awarding of grades, or, you can put it that way, then perhaps when we're looking at grades for graduate admissions, we should keep in mind that there's that sort of, that boost up is required or something like that. I don't know whether any graduate programs actually do any kind of affirmative action like that, like undergrad programs in the US have a history of. So that's one way to think about it. I mean, there's other ways to think about it, right? And Abdullah was also talking about the leaky pipeline, and apart from the grades sort of situation, there's a benefit to be had, a utility from diversity in the grad program itself. So another reason to do affirmative action. My point was just to say, I mean, definitely in the UK, grad admissions are often very much based on marks, grades alone. So this was just to say that there is evidence of systematic differences. And we don't know what those, the reasons for those differences are. So, take those grades with a pinch of salt.
Great, thanks. So Brooks, I'll turn to you now. So first of all, there is a comment from YouTube that just said that the assignment was very impressive and meaningful. So I thought I would just put that out there just to, just to brighten your day a little bit. So somebody really liked it. So a couple of quick questions though, I believe from Martha Olney. So one, and they're short questions, so I'll go ahead and give them both to you. So one is, do you look at finance and economics degrees together or separately, or do you include finance at all? And so the reason for the question, I think, is because they're similar, but most people that get a degree in finance would not call themselves economists. And then a sort of a corollary to that is, did you check with any alumni associations to see what share of econ majors actually labeled themselves, their occupation as economists?
Yeah, those are great questions. So first of all, the American Community Survey doesn't tell us what major, so we can't distinguish what their major was between finance and economists. We do have their occupational codes that they list, as well as the NAICS code, which is the industry classification code that we can use to do that. So many of the students, and at least in my experience in this class, are really interested in public policy issues. I would say probably 100% of them don't go into a finance career as economists. So my guess is those people that self-report as economists on the American Community Survey are likely the ones that are most similar to the students, at least I have in our class. And then the second question, that's a great suggestion. No, we've not really probed about this question about how economists self-report what occupation you're in. That's interesting. I'd love to follow up on that.
Great, thanks. So Abdullah, I'll turn to you now. So you had a few questions in here. One was you did get a shout out from a former student in the YouTube comments. So that maybe says something to your inclusive classroom that students feel like they belong. So I think that's worth mentioning. So somebody made the note, and I know there's been some discussion about this in the chat, but they said that it's interesting that STEM attracts twice as many women as econ does in percentage terms. Why do you think this is happening, or what do you think is happening that's drawing women more towards STEM and less towards econ?
So first of all, to the former student, thank you. I really appreciate you being here, supporting me years after you've graduated. To the rest of the audience, and with respect to the question, STEM has really made an effort in the past 10 to 15 years to attack this issue. They've done a lot of outreach efforts. They've targeted minority and women students at the middle, actually from elementary school all the way to high school. So they've been explicit about their efforts. They recognized the problems, they indicated it was a problem, and then they put the money behind it and all their efforts. It's something I wish we would do in economics. Right now, we're taught a lot about it. I would love to see the funding, the recognition of effort that are successful. You know, our profession relies on developing a pipeline, but also developing a diverse body for us to tackle the real life issues that we're facing every day.
Great, thanks. Okay, so I wanted to go, so I've seen the flavor of the comments, I think, has reflected this question, even if nobody's asked it specifically this way. But so let me pose this to each of you, and maybe we'll start with Brahma and then go with Brooks and then Abdullah. Let's think about change, and let's think about both maybe big C change and small c change. And so what is like one thing, if an instructor wants to make their classroom more inclusive, one thing, if that's all you could tell them, what would you recommend they do? That would be the small change. And then the big change, maybe at the institution level or the department level, whatever you think, what would be a big change you could make at that level to make things more inclusive if you could just choose one?
Great, that's an excellent question. It's a tough one, which is what the best questions always are. I think the small c change, I would say, is, you know, just being a little more reflective of what you say, how you say, what you do in the classroom. It takes work because we get into our habits and talk in certain ways that we're used to talking with our buddies and with the rest of the profession and so on. And we've just seen that it's not very diverse. So thinking a little bit about the implications of what you do and how you hold yourself and so on. It's very easy to, you know, offend unintentionally, I think, as we've seen. I mean, yeah, you know, this is econ, right? We could go into so many things about this. Just, you know, stopping for a second and thinking might be a good idea for many people. Big C change is difficult, but I you know, it really looks to be like, and, you know, apart from this empirical, the data analysis, we've also run focus groups and things like that. And what we're hearing from a lot of students is that they don't see people like them. They don't talk about things that affect people like them. So why should I study econ? And there was a question before about, you know, STEM does better than us, because people understand that science is important, irrespective of who you are. And econ just talks about stuff that's irrelevant to me. Not sure how to sort of change that quickly, but that would be my big C change.
Great, thanks. Brooks, what do you think?
First suggestion is in the classroom and readings is just stop citing only white males in your class in terms of literature, bring in other points of view, etc. I also would encourage people to be more open to take challenges to orthodox economics. Stratification economics and Sandy Darity's work would be an excellent start to do that. As far as department-wise, I think that we need to take specific actions rather than just discussing and having conversations. So, for example, we've got to just be more open about challenging the current orthodoxy in economics and thinking about the best way to do that. And I think part of that is going to use works other than white males in your courses, textbooks, journal articles, etc. Right? Lisa Cook's got a great article on violence and economic growth. That should be something you should teach in the principles class, I think. So those are some of my suggestions.
Great. Abdullah, how about you?
I will answer this question. I'll weave in a question that's popping up frequently in the chat. And the change really simply put is we really need to start to care about the student, be explicit about showing the fact that we care about their success in the classroom and just overall as human beings. We have to be genuine about that. And to do that, some people have been asking, what are examples of interventions? You know, one intervention that I love is, you know, set expectations. Be clear about your expectations, because we know from the research is, you know, the majority students are more likely to ask for, you know, exceptions. And once you start to give exceptions, students talk to each other. We assume that we're giving one student an exception, but it's harming other people because they do talk to each other. I love the 15-minute rule, which is a rule to show up before class and have a genuine conversation. It is going to be uncomfortable for you, but also for the students, because a lot of students, especially international students, I'll use my own example, we're not used to that authority, gap is a big gap. So it takes a while for us to know that you're genuinely interested in getting to know us. So, the concept of office hours, it's talked about by Jack in The Privileged Poor. It's something that I'm really, passionate about. Don't hold your office, first of all, change the name. It's not office hours because students don't know what office hours means. They assume that it means that it's your time to work. Change it to student hours. I've introduced, Starbucks hours where I meet students at Starbucks and it's my regular office hour. I'm just meeting there, hopefully break those barriers. But the big change, the thing that I really want to see is I want to see our profession really focus on those intro level and undergraduate education as valuable resources that, educators, value the educators that teach in that area. We are good at what we do, and we need, we need the administration to recognize that we're the beginning of the pipeline. So I would love to see more resources devoted to making the intro level, the first year experience, a better experience.
Great. So I'm going to wrap. We've got a couple minutes left. I'm going to wrap up with one final question. So there is another question raised in the chat. Given that we have all now done some form of online teaching, and we are likely going to continue to do so for the foreseeable future, there's a fear that we might lose some of that sense of belonging in the classroom that we might be able to create in a physical space that's hard to do online. So if anybody wants to chime in with recommendations on how to create that sense of belonging in your online classroom.
Well, I can speak from my experience. So if you notice in our project, we had the in-class lab, and what we do is I'm always over the shoulder of students working with the STATA code and showing them that it's okay to make mistakes. And a lot of times the errors you get in STATA are just STATA yelling at you, and they're really simple solutions, and they really appreciate that. What I plan to do in the fall and in the spring when I offer this class again is encourage the one-on-one office hours with screen sharing. I did that this spring, and that seemed to help quite a bit, at least somewhat replicate the interactions that they had on campus. But I'll have to tell you, the course evaluations, that was one thing they really missed, was just sitting next to the student and working with the code. And it's very hard to do that in a Zoom environment.
My approach has been, I've been on sabbatical, so I didn't go through the issues that everybody else has experienced with the transition due to COVID. So I will admit that I have more time to adjust, than most of you had. But I'm revamping, I'm creating videos with my own personality, trying to avoid the cliche graph and stuff, but more of a conversation with students. And then I plan to have, informal Zoom meetings. I will have to alternate the time in the fall semester, depending on where students are, because, being in Oman right now, I'm following, I'm facing the difficulties that your students have. Most conferences or most meetings are midnight for me. So that's something that James Tierney talked about yesterday. And we really need to be conscious about the time difference.
I want to be mindful of time, and I know there's more thoughts we could have, but I want to be mindful of time. So I want to thank, first of all of our speakers. Great presentations today, and great discussion to follow up. So now what we're going to do is transition over to the breakout rooms. So if you hang out for just a second, you're going to be put into a breakout room, and be sure that you come back for the second session in about 10 minutes.